The last Vorkuta warship had broken, apart above the ruins of Vorkuta Prime 3. Days ago, the pieces of it were still falling through the sky, burning bright like orange and red stars when the celebrations began. Every ship in the Helios conquered fleet lit up at once, lights, sounds, music. The void of space, usually cold and silent, was suddenly full of noise. Admiral Vexar, of the Zithani people, stood at the front viewport of her flagship, the Eternal Crest, and watched it all happen. She had silver skin and 4 pale eyes, and right now all 4 of them were wet. She had waited a long time for this moment, longer than most people had even been alive. The Vorkuta Dominion had ruled through fear and fire for over 200 years. They had burned whole cities. They had taken people as slaves from a dozen star systems. They had done things that Vexar could not think about without feeling sick and angry at the same time. And now they were finished. She pressed one hand flat against the cold glass of the viewport and breathed slowly. Around her, her crew cheered and hugged each other. Some of them were crying. Some of them were laughing. Some were doing both at once. Behind her, Lieutenant Casso, a young Zithani officer with barely 3 years of service, was dancing in the middle of the bridge. Nobody told him to stop. Messages were coming in from everywhere. From the Pelori home fleet, from the Chuan wreck battle groups, from the small stubborn ships of the Morin who had fought in every single battle of the war without ever asking for anything in return. From colony worlds that had lived under Vorkuta occupation for decades. They all said the same thing in different ways. We actually made it on the conquered communication channels. The voices of 47 different species mixed together into something that was almost like music. Vexar turned away from the viewport and walked to her command chair. Her second officer, Commander Drell, handed her a small cup of warm drink, as the Zithani tradition after a victory. She took it but did not drink yet. There was something she needed to say. First, she opened the fleet-wide channel. Her voice was steady and clear. She spoke in the common tongue of the conquered, the trade language that every species used when they needed to understand each other. She thanked the fleet. She named the battles. She named the dead. There were a lot of names. The war had cost everyone something. Some species had lost whole fleets. Some had lost whole worlds, but here at the end of it they had won. When she finished speaking, the cheering started again, louder this time. Drell leaned close to her and said quietly, "The formal ceremony will be in 6 hours. The Pelori want to do it above Vorkuta Prime itself. They say it sends the right message." Vexar nodded. "Fine. Who is representing each fleet?" Drell read from his screen. "Zithani, yourself. Pelori, Admiral Haas. Shunrek, the Grand Commander. Morin, their council. Speaker. The smaller fleets are sending their senior officers." He paused for a moment. "And the Terrans?" He stopped. Vexar looked at him. "The Terrans." Drell shook his head slowly. "No representative listed. No ship in formation. No response on any channel." He looked uncomfortable. "Actually, Admiral, there has been no response from Earth or any Terran ship for the past 18 months. The word fell into the room like a stone into still water. 18 months. Vexa set down her cup. She had known this, of course. Everyone in the conquered high command knew it. 18 Months ago, the Terrans had simply gone. Quiet, no warning, no explanation. Their ambassadors had left every conquered station, their warships had pulled back. From every front line, every message sent to Earth had come back unanswered or had been met with 3 short words: Terra is occupied. Nobody knew what that meant. The conquered had debated it for weeks before. The pressure of the war forced them to move on without answers. Some believed the Vorkai had struck Earth in secret, a hidden attack that the conquered had not detected. Some believed there had been a political collapse on Earth, some internal crisis, too embarrassing for humans to admit. Few of the more cautious voices in the high command said they should wait, that humans had surprised everyone before and would probably do so again. Most people, after 6 months of silence, quietly stopped expecting the Terrans to come back at all. A Pelori diplomat, a wide, flat-faced creature named Osik, who had had a gift for saying cruel things while smiling, had made a remark at one of the high command meetings that had spread through the fleet like a bad smell. He had looked at the empty seat at the table where the Terran ambassador used to sit, and he had said quite pleasantly, the Terrans always arrive late if they arrive at all. Perhaps this time they simply did not bother. People had laughed, not everyone, but enough. Vexa had not laughed. She did not find it funny. She had met humans before. She had fought alongside them in 2 campaigns before this war even began. She knew what they were like: stubborn, strange, sometimes difficult to understand, but never cowards. Whatever the reason for their silence, she did not believe for one moment that they had simply given up. But 18 months was a long time, and the war had not waited. The ceremony above Vorkai Prime was everything the Pelori had promised. Grand, formal, full of speeches and symbols and the kind of carefully arranged pageantry that took hours to put together. Representatives from every major species stood in a long line aboard the neutral station that had been set up in orbit. There were lights, there were anthems, there were medals given to the living, and names read out for the dead. The Terran seat at the ceremony table was empty. Nobody said anything about it directly, but everyone noticed. Osik the diplomat sat near the empty chair and smiled at it once, briefly. When he thought no one was looking, Vexar saw him do it from across the room and said nothing, but she remembered. The ceremony lasted 4 hours. By the end of it, the fleet was exhausted and happy, and already talking about going home. The Vorkai remnant, the broken remains of their military, the pieces that had survived the final battle, was scattered and leaderless. There would be work to do: clean up, peace talks, the slow, difficult business of putting damaged worlds back together. But the hard part was done, or so everyone believed. On the bridge of the Eternal Crest, as the ceremony wound down and officers moved around her talking about dinner, rotations and shore leave schedules, a young sensor operator named Tev looked up from her console with a confused expression on her face. She checked her readings twice, then a third time. Then she turned in her chair and said, in a voice that was not quite steady, "Admiral, I have contacts on long-range sensors coming from the edge of charted space." Vexar walked to the sensor station. Vorkai remnant, no. Tev's voice got quieter. The signatures don't match anything in our database. They are. She paused. They are very large, and there are a lot of them. They were running cold until about 2 Minutes ago. Whatever they are, they didn't want to be seen until now. Vexar stared at the screen. The contacts were still far away, but they were not slowing down. They were moving with purpose, in tight formation, heading toward the center of the fleet. How many? She asked. Tev counted. Her mouth moved without making a sound for a moment. At least dozens. The celebrating for a moment stopped. The contacts did not slow down. Vexar stood at the sensor station of the Eternal Crest and watched the numbers change on Tev's screen. The objects, whatever they were still coming in from the far edge of charted space, moving at a speed that made the room feel colder. She had been in the conquered fleet for 31 years. She had seen a lot of things on sensor screens. She had never seen contacts this large, moving this fast in such tight formation. Thermal bloom is increasing, Tev said. They were running cold before, now they are warming up, whatever they were doing, hiding, resting, traveling slow. They are done with that now. Can we get a shape on them yet? Not clearly, but Tev's fingers moved across her panel. The drive signatures. I think I have seen something like this before. Not exactly like this, but close. Admiral, I need to check the old Terran fleet records. Vexna felt something move in her chest. Not quite fear, not quite hope. Something between the two that had no good name. Check them, she said. While Tev worked, Vexna thought about what she knew about humans, which she realized was perhaps less than she had always believed. 18 months ago, in the middle of the war, the Terrans had gone completely silent. That was the fact everyone in the Conquered had been living with. But what had actually happened during those 18 months? Nobody knew, and nobody had thought very hard about it because the war had been loud and demanding and full of things that needed immediate attention. Now watching those contacts grow slowly on the screen, Vexna started to think about it very carefully. On Earth, 18 months and 3 weeks ago, single Vorkai ship had arrived without warning. It did not shoot, it simply appeared in Terran space and broadcast a message on all frequencies. The message was short. It contained 2 things, a list of coordinates and a video. The coordinates pointed to 12 different locations spread across Vorkai. Controlled space. The video showed what was at each location a weapon. The Terrans had no name for it at first. They would eventually call it the Soul Render. The Soul Render was not a weapon for killing soldiers or destroying ships. It was a weapon for killing worlds. Single device, the size of a small moon, could strip a planet's entire surface of life in under 6 hours. The atmosphere would be torn away, the oceans would burn, everything that had ever grown or breathed or moved on that world would be gone before the second sunrise. The Vorkai had 12 of them, and according to the message, all 12 were aimed at Earth. The terms were simple. Terra would withdraw from the Conquered immediately and completely. No ships in Conquered space. No ambassadors at Conquered stations. No communication with any Conquered member. Terra would go dark and stay dark, and it would say nothing to anyone about why. If the Conquered asked, Terra would say nothing. If the Conquered reached out, Terra would not answer. And if Terra broke these terms in any way, if a single Terran ship was spotted helping the Conquered, if a single Terran voice was heard on a Conquered channel, the Vorkai would begin firing. One world At a time starting with the most populated, Earth's Unified Fleet Command had met in emergency session within the hour. The meeting lasted 40 minutes. The vote was not close. Terra would comply. They would go dark. They would let the conquered believe whatever the conquered wanted to believe. And they would use the time, every single day of it, to do what humans had always done when someone backed them into a corner. They would find a way out that nobody saw coming. The shipyards in the asteroid belt ran without stopping. 3 shifts around the clock, 7 days a week for 18 months. New ships were built in secret, in the dark, in locations that did not appear on any conquered map. Workers lived on the construction platforms for months at a time. Nobody left, nobody talked. The communications blackout applied to everyone, not just the military. Ordinary Terran citizens went without news from the outside galaxy for a year and a half, knowing only that something serious was happening and that they needed to trust their fleet. They trusted their fleet. The engineers worked on new designs, not the light, fast ships that the conquered had always associated with the Terran military. Something different, something heavier, something built not for quick raids and surgical strikes, but for the kind of raw, sustained punishment that could crack open a fortress from the outside. They called the new class the Dreadnought. Each one was 3 times the size of the largest Zethani warship. Each one carried enough firepower to fight an entire Vorkai battle group and win. And they were building 34 of them. But ships were only part of the problem. The soul renders had to go. This was the real mission. The ships were just a tool. The actual goal, the thing that everything else depended on, was finding and destroying every single soul render before they could be used. If even one of them fired, a world would die. Maybe Earth, maybe a conquered planet, maybe something that had never done anything wrong to anyone. Terran scouts moved through Vorkai space in ships so small and so quiet that most sensors couldn't find them. They mapped patrol routes. They identified blind spots. They watched and waited and noted and reported back to Fleet Command in tight encrypted bursts, so short that Vorkai detection systems would read them as background noise. It took 7 months to locate all 12 soul renders with certainty. It took another 4 months to plan the strikes, and then over the course of 10 days, 12 strike teams moved through Vorkai territory in the dark. No fleet support, no one who knew where they were, except Fleet Command. They went in, they did what they needed to do, and they came back, most of them. The soul renders were gone, and then, for 3 more months, the Terran fleet finished building its ships and waited. They watched the conquered war from the outside. They saw the battles, they saw the losses, they saw their allies there, friends fighting and dying without Terran help. That part was hard. That part was, for many of the officers and soldiers involved, the hardest thing they had ever done. But they held the line. They waited until they were sure, until the conquered had won and the Vorkai were broken and the danger of those 12 terrible weapons was gone forever. And then they moved back on the Eternal Crest. Tav looked up from her console. Her face was strange, like someone who has just solved a puzzle and is not sure whether to be relieved or frightened by the answer. I have the drive signatures matched. She said they are Terran. Configurations are new. We have never seen most of these ship classes before. but the core signature patterns are Terran. She paused. All of them. Vexa stood very still. How many? She asked again because the number on the screen still seemed impossible. Tav looked at her screen more time. 34. Contacts consistent with a new class. Very large, possibly dreadnought scale. Over 200 cruiserweight contacts and something else, something we have no category for. I am calling them C carriers for now because I do not know what else to call them. She swallowed. They are broadcasting, Admiral, on all frequencies, in every language in the Concord database. Vexia straightened up. Around her the bridge had gone completely quiet. Every officer was watching her. Put it on, she said. The voice that came through the speakers was calm. Not calm the way a person is calm when nothing bad is happening. Calm the way a person is calm when they have decided fully and completely that they are going to say what needs to be said and nothing is going to stop them. There is a difference between those two kinds of calm, and everyone on the bridge of the Eternal Crest heard it immediately. The woman on the screen was human. She stood on the bridge of a ship that none of them recognized. Dark interior. Sharp lines built for function rather than appearance. She wore a plain dark uniform with small rank marks at the collar. Her hair was pulled back. Her face was steady. She looked like someone who had not slept enough in a very long time but had stopped noticing. She said her name. Admiral Yara Solis, Terran Unified Fleet. She said to the Galactic Concord to the Vorkai Remnant, to anyone else who is listening. 18 months ago your enemy threatened our world to make us abandon you. We chose a third option. We are late, we apologize, but we bring receipts. Then she transmitted a file on every ship in the Concord fleet, screens lit up with coordinates, 12 sets of them. Each one labeled, each one accompanied by sensor data, visual records, and a short video showing the same thing. Debris, wreckage floating in space. Remains of something very large that had been destroyed completely. 12 locations, 12 debris fields, 12 soul renders that no longer existed. For a moment, nobody on any ship said anything, then everyone said something at once. On the Eternal Crest, Vexa stood in the middle of the noise and said nothing. She watched the coordinates on the screen and thought about 12 terrible weapons that had been aimed at her allies for a year and a half. And she thought about the people who had gone into Vorkai's space in the dark and taken those weapons apart one by one. And she felt something that took her a moment to name. It was not surprise exactly. It was something closer to shame. The feeling of realizing that while she had been winning a war, someone else had been quietly doing the harder thing. Across the fleet channel, the Pelori, Admiral Haas was shouting, not in anger, in disbelief. His wide, flat face was filling the communication screen, and he was cycling through the coordinates one by one, and saying the same word over and over. His own language, it translated roughly as impossible. At another station, a Chuanrek tactical officer had pulled up everything in the Concord database about soul render technology and was reading it very fast, checking it against the debris data the Terrans had just sent. Over. After a few minutes, she said quietly to no one in particular. These destructions are real, the energy signatures match, they actually did it. She said it like she was trying to convince herself. On the other side of the fleet, Among the shattered remains of the Vorka military, things were moving very quickly in a different direction. The Vorkai remnant commanders had been watching the Terran fleet emerge from the dark with the particular fear of people who know exactly what they are looking at. They had known about the humans. They had arranged the whole thing. The threat, the silence, the 18 months of Terra going dark, and for a year and a half they had believed it was working. The Terrans had stayed quiet. The conquered had won the war without them, which was unfortunate but manageable. The Dominion was broken, yes, but the remnant could survive. They could negotiate, they still had leverage. They no longer had leverage. The first Vorkai commander to transmit a surrender signal did so within 4 minutes of the Terran broadcast. He sent it specifically to the TES Inexorable Admiral Solis's ship, and not to the conquered. The second surrender signal followed 6 minutes later, then a third, then 7 more in the space of half an hour. They were all sent to the Terrans. On the Eternal Crest, Vexus's communications officer brought this to her attention with a bewildered expression. "The remnant is surrendering," he said. "But they are not surrendering to us. They are surrendering to the Terran fleet." Then she looked at the Chan wreck veteran who had been at her side for the last 4 years of the war, an old soldier named Grath who had fought the Vorkai longer than anyone else on the ship. She asked him the question that her communications officer did not have the experience to ask: why? Grath looked at the screen where the Terran fleet was still coming, steady and dark and enormous. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "Because the Vorkai threatened them directly, and the humans said nothing for 18 months, and then this." He nodded at the screen. "They know what comes next for the people who threaten their world. They would rather surrender now than wait for it." He paused. "There are old stories," he said, "about what happens when you make humans truly angry. I always thought they were meant to frighten young soldiers. I am no longer sure they were exaggerated." On the bridge of the Inexorable, Admiral Solis watched the surrender signals come in and did not smile. She had expected this, she had planned for it, but there was no satisfaction in it, only a kind of tired relief that it was working the way it was supposed to. Her first officer, Commander Reyes, came to stand beside her. He was a broad man with a quiet voice and 20 years of service. He had been with her through all of it. The secret meetings, the dark campaigns, the months of watching the war from the outside without being able to help. He knew better than almost anyone what the last 18 months had cost. "Conquered flag channel is open," he said. "Admiral Vexa is requesting to speak with you." Solis nodded, put her through. The Zafani admiral appeared on the screen. Silver skin, 4 pale eyes, and an expression that Solis had seen on the faces of people who have just had a very long and confusing day. The look of someone trying to organize too many feelings into a shape that makes sense. They looked at each other for a moment. Across species, across 18 months of silence and distance, and a war that had been fought without them. They looked at each other. Then Solis said, "We heard you won. Congratulations." Vexa said nothing for a moment, then in a voice that was careful and steady, "Thank you, your timing is notable. We came as fast as we could," Solis said. It was true in more ways than one. Another pause. Vex's eyes moved to the Coordinates still on her screen, the 12. Debris fields. The soul renders, Vexa said. You found them all. All 12 confirmed destroyed. We have full documentation. I will send it to your command staff. Vexa pressed her lips together for a moment. There will be questions, she said. Many questions from many people about the silence, about the decision to act alone. I know, Solace said. She did not look defensive. She did not look apologetic. She looked like someone who had made a very difficult choice and was prepared to stand in front of it. We will answer them all. But first, she tilted her head slightly toward the viewport where the Vorkai remnant surrender signals were still coming in. Do you want help cleaning up, or were you going to manage the remnant alone? For the first time in the conversation, something moved across Vexa's face. It was not quite a smile. It was something older and quieter than a smile. It was the expression of someone who has just remembered why they liked the person. Send your fleet coordinates, Vexa said. We will sort out the rest later. Understood. Solace reached forward to close the channel, then stopped. Admiral Vexa, for what it's worth, we watched the whole war. We saw what you all did. What it cost. Her voice did not change. But something behind her eyes did. You did not need us. I want you to know we understand that. Vexa held her gaze for one more moment. We needed you, she said quietly. We simply did not know it yet. The channel closed. Outside the viewports of every conquered ship, the Terran fleet continued its slow, enormous approach. 34 dreadnoughts and more than 200 cruisers moving with the calm certainty of something that had been waiting a long time to arrive. The Conquered did not handle the news well. At first, this was understandable. The Galactic Conquered was 47 species, trying to agree on things, which was already difficult enough in good times. What happened in the hours after the Terran fleet arrived was not good times. It was a storm of voices and arguments, and demands and feelings that had been building for 18 months suddenly needing to go somewhere. Emergency sessions were called. High commanders who had been planning their shore leave 30 minutes ago were suddenly sitting in meeting rooms looking at each other across tables and trying to decide what exactly had just happened and what it meant. Some species were furious. The Pelori Council sent an official communication to the Conquered High Command within 2 hours of the Terran broadcast stating that Terra's unilateral action, withdrawing from the war without explanation, refusing all contact, operating independently in Vorkai space, was a serious violation of the Conquered Charter and needed to be formally addressed. They used the word serious 4 times in 3 paragraphs. Other species were less angry and more confused. The Morwen, who had fought in every single battle of the war and lost more ships per capita than anyone else, sent their council speaker to the meeting with a single question. If the Terrans had known about the soul renders from the beginning, why hadn't they said so? The Morwen homeworld was in the same star cluster as 2 of the destroyed soul render sites. They wanted to know how close they had come to dying without knowing it. And then there were the species that were simply stunned. The Chanrek historian, who had been pulling records earlier, was now sitting in a corner of the station's common area with a cup of something cold that she had forgotten to drink. reading through everything she could find about human history. She had been there for 3 hours. Nobody disturbed her. In the middle of all of this, Admiral Solis arrived. She came with a small delegation, 6 people, no ceremony, no honor guard, no formal uniforms, no special lighting or music. They walked through the station corridor like people who were there to do a job and would appreciate it if everyone could move a little faster. Several conquered officers in the hallway stopped and stared as they passed. One young Ziatani ensign actually stepped backward into a wall. Solis herself noticed none of this or pretended not to. Admiral Vexa met her at the entrance to the main meeting room. They stood face to face for the first time, 2 people who had spoken through a screen an hour ago and were now close enough to shake hands, which humans did, and Zatani did not, so they settled for a nod that somehow managed to carry the weight of everything that needed to be said. Inside the meeting room, it took about 4 minutes for things to get difficult. Osak, the diplomat, the same Pelori official who had made the remark about Terrans always being late, spoke first. He had a gift for framing things in a way that sounded reasonable while being pointed. He looked at Solis and said, very pleasantly, that surely the Admiral would agree that the Conquered Charter existed for good reasons, and that member species were expected to share relevant information with their allies, and that 18 months of complete silence during a war was a matter that required a clear explanation. Solis looked at him steadily. The Vorkai had 12 weapons capable of destroying populated planets, she said. They were aimed at Earth. The condition for not firing them was that we go completely dark, no contact, no communication, nothing that would indicate we were working against them. If we had told you, the Vorkai would have known we told you, you would have mobilized, they would have fired. She paused. We made a calculation. It worked. It might not have, Osak said. No, Solis agreed. It might not have. We knew that. The room was quiet for a moment. An old Chu and Rek commander named Veth, who had fought the Vorkai for 20 years and lost a brother to them early in the war, leaned forward in his chair. The soul renders, he said, you said they were aimed at Earth, but we found evidence of 2 of them in our own territory. Were they aimed only at Earth, or were they positioned to reach conquered worlds as well? Solis his eyes. Both, she said. Earth first if we broke terms, but they positioning made it clear they intended to use the remaining weapons on conquered planets eventually, once the war was settled in their favor. We believe they plan to keep the soul renders as a deterrent to prevent the conquered from rebuilding after a victory. Vet sat back. He was quiet for a long moment, then he said something in his own language that the translation system rendered as, then they destroyed weapons that would have killed all of us. He said it to no one in particular, as if he was simply noting a fact that needed to be said out loud. The argument continued for another 2 hours. It was not always polite. There were moments when voices rose. There were moments when the discussion circled back on itself and covered the same ground 3 times. But something had shifted in the room, and everyone could feel it. The Terrans had done something that was technically against the rules and had also, in doing so, saved an unknown number of lives. These 2 things existed at the same time and refused to cancel each other out. After the formal session, a Pellery historian named Tessic found her way to the smaller side room where some of the Terran delegation had gathered. She was not an officer, she was a scholar, a small woman with a notebook, who had spent 40 years studying spacefaring civilizations and their histories. She had read a great deal about humans. She had a specific question. She found a young Terran officer, a lieutenant named Park, who was sitting against the wall eating something from a sealed container and looking at his screen. She sat down near him and said very carefully that she hoped he did not mind a question. He said he did not mind. She asked, how have they done it? Not the technical part. She understood the technical part, more or less. She meant the other part. The 18 months of silence, watching the war, not being able to help, carrying that weight every day while not knowing for certain whether the plan would work, whether the weapons would be destroyed in time, whether their allies would survive the war they were watching from the outside. Park was quiet for a moment. He looked at his container of food. Then he said, we are very good at carrying things. It is kind of our thing. She wrote it down. The formal reconvening of the Galactic Concord happened 2 days later. By then the Vorkai remnant had fully surrendered. The 12 debris fields had been verified by independent Concord science teams. The documentation the Terrans had provided, months of scout reports, strike mission records, technical analysis of each destroyed soul render, had been reviewed by 3 separate intelligence teams from 3 different species and found to be accurate and complete. At the reconvening, a motion was raised by the Toon Rec delegation. They proposed that Terra's seat on the Concord, which had been quietly reduced in influence during the 18 months of absence, and which several species had suggested removing entirely, be not just restored, but elevated. A permanent seat on the High Council, one of 5, a kind of seat that carried real weight in every decision the Concord made. The vote was 44 in favor, 3 against. The 3 who voted against were the same 3 species that had, over the past 18 months, quietly claimed Terra's old trade routes and treaty rights while humanity was silent. Nobody commented on this out loud, but everyone noticed, outside the meeting room through the viewport, the Terran fleet held its position, steady, enormous, still running slightly warmer than standard after their long journey through the dark. 34 dreadnoughts that had not existed 18 months ago. 200 cruisers built in secret, a story that was only beginning to be understood. Vexa stood at the viewport for a while. After the vote, Drell came to stand beside her after a few minutes. What are you thinking? He asked. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I am thinking that I am very glad they are on our side. Drell nodded. Do you think they always will be? Vexa looked at the fleet in the dark and thought about 18 months of silence and 12 destroyed weapons and a lieutenant sitting against a wall saying, we are very good at carrying things. Yes, she said, I think they will. A month later, they did the celebration. Again properly this time. The first celebration had been good, genuine, and earned, but everyone quietly agreed that it had been missing something. Now, with the Vorkai remnant fully surrendered and the peace terms in place, and the truth about the 18 months finally understood, the Concord gathered again. This time the Terran fleet was in Formation with the rest. This time, the empty seat at the table was filled. It was a big event. There was music. There were lights. There were speeches from representatives of dozens of species, most of them saying things that were true and heartfelt and a little long. The Pellery Admiral Hauss, who had not believed a single kind word about humans 3 weeks ago, gave a speech that ended with him admitting in front of the entire assembled fleet that he had been wrong about a great many things, and that he hoped to have the opportunity to be less wrong going forward. It was as close to an apology as Pellery culture allowed, and coming from him, it was a considerable thing. The Terrans listened politely to all of it. They did not celebrate the way the other species did. It was not that they were unhappy or ungrateful. Anyone who watched them closely could see they were neither of those things. They were present. They shook hands and returned greetings and attended every event they were invited to. But there was something underneath their politeness that the conquered species kept noticing without being able to name. Something careful, something that looked outward more than inward. Admiral Solis gave one speech. It was short. It was not about victory. She spoke about the people who had died in the secret campaign, the scouts who had moved through Vorkai space alone and not come back, the engineers who had worked 20-hour shifts for months and had heart attacks on the construction platforms, the soldiers in the 12 strike teams, most of whom had returned, some of whom had not. Their names had been classified for 18 months. Now she said them out loud, one by one, while the rest of the room went very still. She did not say they were heroes. She said they were people who made a choice. And the choice was hard, and it might not have worked, and they all knew that. And they did it anyway. She said, "We will spend the rest of our lives deciding if we were brave or just lucky." She said, "They deserve better than certainty, so we will give them honesty instead." Several conquered officers who had come to the speech expecting something triumphant found themselves quietly moved in a way they had not anticipated. The Pellery historian Tessic, sitting the third row, wrote in her notebook. They grieve differently. They put it in front of them and look at it directly. She underlined the last line twice. After the ceremony, the real work continued. Peace negotiations with the Vorkai remnant were complicated and slow. Occupied worlds needed resources and support, and in some cases, entire new governments. The conquered had 100 things to do, and not enough ships or people to do all of them at once. The Terran fleet slotted into this work without being asked, taking on patrol routes and supply runs, and the long, unglamorous tasks that kept the peace process moving but earned no praise. It was during this period that the science teams made their discovery. 3 conquered research ships had been assigned to study the debris from the 12 destroyed Sol renders. It was standard procedure. Whenever new weapon type was encountered, you studied what was left of it. Mostly the teams expected to document Vorka engineering and file their reports and go home. Instead, they found something that made 2 of the team leaders request immediate meetings with the conquered high command. The Sol renders were not Vorkai technology, not originally. The core components, the parts that made the devices actually work. The pieces that no Vorkai engineer could have designed, because the science behind them was 200 years ahead of Anything the Vorkai had ever produced had been built by someone else and stamped in a notation system that no one in the Conquered had ever seen before, with a mark that appeared on all 12 devices, the same mark, as if they had all come from the same place. The lead researcher, a Chun Rex scientist named Das, presented the findings to the High Command with the careful, neutral voice of someone delivering information that they personally wish they did not have. She said, "The Vorkai did not invent these weapons. Someone gave them to the Vorkai." She said, "The notation system does not match any known civilization in Conquered records." She said, "We found traces of the same notation system in 3 other places, weapon systems from 2 older conflicts that the Conquered had archived and forgotten about, both of which had been given to one side of each conflict, and both of which had resulted in one side being destroyed." The room went very quiet. Someone had been doing this for a long time, picking a side, giving them something terrible, and then presumably picking another side, and doing it again. The Conquered species looked at each other across the table and felt the specific fear of people who have just won a war and discovered in the winning of it that they may have been pieces in someone else's game all along. The Terrans in the room did not look afraid. Commander Reyes, who was representing the Terran fleet at the briefing, while Solis reviewed the technical data, another room listened to the full presentation without interrupting. When Das finished, there was a long silence. Then Reyes said, "How old is the oldest example of this notation system?" Does checked her notes. "Based on the artifacts we have compared it to at least 600 years, possibly older." Reyes nodded slowly. He looked at the notation mark on the screen for a moment, then he said, "We will need to see everything, all the records, all the comparisons." "What do you intend to do?" the Pelori representative asked. Reyes looked at him. "Find the source," he said, as if it were obvious. That evening, Admiral Sala stood at the viewport of the Inexorable and looked out at the stars. She had been there for a while. Reyes came to stand beside her and told her what she already knew, that the High Council had formally requested the Terran fleet's position on pursuing the origin of the soul render technology, that every other species at the table had been frightened, that no one had wanted to be the first to say they would go. Solace listened without turning from the viewport. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. The stars outside were the same stars that had always been there, but they looked different now, not smaller, bigger. "Tell them we have been in worse spots," she said. Her voice was steady and quiet, the same calm she had used to deliver the broadcast a month ago, the kind that came from a decision already made. "Tell them we will go first." Reyes nodded. He turned to go. "Reyes," he stopped. "Make sure the fleet is rested," she said. "All of them. Give them 2 weeks. Tell them to write letters home." She paused. "Then we start." He left. She stayed at the viewport, far away, farther than any Conquered telescope could see, in a dark region between star systems where no ship had ever traveled. Something very old watched the galaxy the way it had always watched it. It had watched civilizations rise and helped some of them fall. It had watched species reach for the stars and nudge certain ones back toward the ground. It had been doing this for a very long time, and it was very good at it. It had been watching Terra for a while. Now, it had provided certain tools to certain parties. It had expected certain outcomes. For the first time in a very long time, it was not entirely sure its calculations were right. Somewhere in the vast dark between galaxies, something ancient and patient, and very sure of itself began very slowly to reconsider